In the late months of 1942, the war in Europe had reached a critical turning point. The Axis powers, led by Nazi Germany, had expanded their reach across much of the continent, and the deserts of North Africa had become a proving ground for strategy, strength, and survival. Britain had fought for months against the formidable Afrika Korps, led by General Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox. Yet, despite their determination, the Allied forces were stretched thin, supplies were low, and morale was unstable. The war demanded a new strategy, a bold maneuver that could open a second front, draw German attention away from the Eastern Front, and set the stage for the liberation of Europe. That strategy would come to be known as Operation Torch. Operation Torch was the first major Allied amphibious invasion of World War II, and, more importantly, it marked the United States' entry into the European theater. Before this moment, the U.S. had fought mainly in the Pacific after the attack on Pearl Harbor. But North Africa offered a new opportunity, a chance to strike directly at Hitler's empire and prove America's strength on the world stage. President Franklin D. Roosevelt and Prime Minister Winston Churchill had met in secret to plan this offensive. Together, they concluded that North Africa was the best place to begin. A soft underbelly, lightly defended by Vichy French forces still loyal, in part, to the Germans. The plan was immense in scale. It would involve nearly 107,000 American and British troops, 3 simultaneous amphibious landings across the North African coast, at Casablanca in Morocco, Oran, and Algiers in Algeria. The operation was commanded by General Dwight D. Eisenhower, a rising American leader whose calm precision and organizational mastery would soon make him a household name. Under him were other key figures: General George S. Patton, known for his aggressive spirit and unshakable confidence, and General Lloyd Fredendall, leading ground operations in the Central Sector. The sea lanes would be protected by a vast naval fleet. More than 350 ships, including aircraft carriers, destroyers, and landing craft. It was a logistical masterpiece, unprecedented in Allied planning so far. The American troops were young. Many had never seen combat before. Yet they carried with them an untested resolve, a sense that this was their moment to define the outcome of the war. They trained for months in secret, rehearsing amphibious landings, learning desert survival, and studying maps of a foreign land most could barely pronounce. They would be fighting not only German and Italian forces but also the Vichy French, a faction of France that had aligned itself with Nazi Germany after France's collapse in 1940. It was an uncomfortable reality. The Allies preparing to fight former friends, men who spoke their language, wore similar uniforms, and in another world might have stood beside them. As the convoys sailed from ports in Britain and the United States, a sense of destiny filled the air. The soldiers watched the endless horizon, knowing that across the Atlantic lay the deserts of North Africa, and the first test of American strength in the European war. For the U.S. Navy, it was the largest overseas convoy ever assembled. The logistics were staggering: refueling ships mid-journey, navigating through stormy Atlantic waters, and maintaining total radio silence to preserve the element of surprise. German U-boats lurked beneath the waves, but the convoys managed to avoid detection, a triumph of secrecy and planning. At dawn on November 8, 1942, the invasion began. The first waves of landing craft approached the North African coast under a dark sky, engines humming quietly to avoid alerting coastal defenses. The beaches at Casablanca, Oran, and Algiers would each witness a unique story of confusion, courage, and confrontation. As American soldiers neared the shore, they were uncertain whether the French defenders would resist or surrender. In some areas, white flags of truce fluttered briefly. In others, gunfire erupted almost immediately. The French, bound by orders from Vichy command, opened fire, unsure whether the Americans were friend or foe. The situation was chaotic, politically charged, and morally complex. At Casablanca, General Patton led the Western Task Force with his trademark ferocity. Waves of U.S. troops landed under heavy coastal artillery fire as battleships off the coast exchanged shells with French defenses. American aircraft bombed strategic targets while naval gunners silenced enemy positions. Despite fierce resistance, Patton's men advanced steadily inland. At Oran, the Central Task Force met similar opposition. But again, the combination of overwhelming American firepower and determination quickly tipped the balance. Algiers, meanwhile, saw a faster resolution. Local French resistance groups rose against Vichy commanders, helping American and British forces take control with minimal bloodshed. By the end of that day, the United States had secured a foothold on North African soil. The cost had been significant. Lives lost, ships damaged, and the painful experience of fighting a former ally. But the outcome was decisive. Operation Torch was a success. The Americans had demonstrated not only their military strength, but also their ability to plan and execute a massive invasion thousands of miles from home. For the first time, German commanders realized that the United States was not a distant threat. It was a force capable of landing armies on foreign shores and holding them. Operation Torch also reshaped the political landscape. Many French officers, seeing the inevitability of Allied victory, switched sides, joining the Free French movement under General Charles de Gaulle. Others surrendered quietly, unwilling to continue a fight they no longer believed in. The moral divide within France became clear. One side trapped in loyalty to a lost cause, the other seeking redemption through alliance with the Americans. As night fell over the North African coast, fires burned on the horizon, reminders of the day's struggle. But amid the smoke and ruin, a new confidence emerged. The U.S. Army had passed its first major test in the European theater. The men who had landed that morning as inexperienced soldiers were now veterans of a complex and dangerous mission. The road ahead, through Tunisia, Sicily, and eventually into mainland Europe, would be long and brutal. But Operation Torch had shown the world that the tide of war was turning, and that the United States was now fully in the fight. The days following the initial landings were marked by uncertainty, tension, and uneasy diplomacy. The beaches of Morocco and Algeria were now under American control. But the war was far from over. Across the dusty towns and port cities of North Africa, the sound of distant gunfire still echoed. The question that lingered in every camp and command post was simple. Would the French continue to resist, or would they lay down their arms and join the Allies? The answer would determine not only the success of Operation Torch, but the future of France itself. General Dwight D. Eisenhower faced one of the most delicate challenges of the entire war. He had not only to win battles, but also to win hearts, to convince French commanders and civilians that the United States had come not as an invader, but as a liberator. The problem was political as much as it was military. Since 1940, France had been divided between two identities. The Vichy regime, which cooperated with Nazi Germany, and the Free French movement, led by General Charles de Gaulle, who had fled to London and vowed to fight on. In North Africa, Many French officers were loyal to Vichy, suspicious of British motives, and uncertain of America's intentions. Eisenhower's orders were clear: minimize bloodshed and bring France to the Allied side as swiftly as possible. To achieve this, he turned to diplomacy, an unusual tool for a battlefield commander. Secret meetings were arranged with high-ranking French officials, including Admiral François Darlan, one of Vichy France's most powerful figures. Darlan happened to be in Algiers at the time of the invasion, and Eisenhower saw an opportunity. If Darlan could be persuaded to order a ceasefire, thousands of French troops could be brought under Allied command without further fighting. It was a risky gamble. Negotiating with a man closely tied to the collaborationist government could spark political backlash in both Washington and London. But Eisenhower understood the cost of continued combat. Every hour of fighting delayed the Allied advance toward Tunisia, where German and Italian reinforcements were already arriving. While the negotiations unfolded, the situation on the ground remained volatile. In Casablanca, General George S. Patton's troops continued to face sporadic resistance from French coastal batteries and armored units. The Americans, though inexperienced in large-scale warfare, fought with growing confidence. Their naval superiority soon tipped the balance. American destroyers and aircraft sank several French ships that had defied ceasefire orders, including the cruiser Primogay and destroyer Albatross. The message was unmistakable. The United States had the firepower and resolve to control the theater. French morale began to falter. Many officers, disillusioned by years of occupation and defeat, quietly ordered their men to stand down. By November 10th, just 2 days after the initial landings, the outcome was clear. French resistance in both Morocco and Algeria had largely collapsed. Darlan, under pressure from his own officers and facing the undeniable might of the American forces, agreed to a ceasefire. He signed an armistice recognizing Allied control over North Africa and ordered all French forces in the region to join the fight against Germany. Eisenhower's gamble had paid off. The guns that had fired on American troops days earlier were now turned toward the Axis. The news spread quickly through the camps and cities. American soldiers who had braced for weeks of hard fighting were suddenly met with cheers from French civilians emerging from their homes. In Algiers and Oran, tricolor flags returned to balconies where Nazi banners had hung only months before. For the first time in years, people sang the Marseillaise freely in the streets. Though tensions remained, and some French units were still skeptical of Allied promises, the general atmosphere shifted dramatically. The Americans were no longer seen as conquerors, but as liberators who had reignited the possibility of France's redemption. In Washington, President Roosevelt received the reports with cautious optimism. Operation Torch had achieved what many strategists had doubted was possible: the unification of Allied and French forces without a prolonged campaign. It was a moral victory as much as a military one. For the United States, still new to the global stage, it was a defining moment, proof that American leadership, both strategic and diplomatic, could change the course of the war. For the French, it was a moment of reckoning. The defeat of Vichy control in North Africa marked the symbolic beginning of France's return to the Allied cause. But beneath the triumph, complexities lingered. The decision to work with Darlan, a man who had served under the collaborationist Vichy regime, angered many, particularly Charles de Gaulle and his supporters. De Gaulle saw the deal as a betrayal of the Free French cause, and tensions between him and the American command would continue to strain relations throughout the war. Yet, in the immediate sense, Eisenhower's pragmatism had achieved its purpose. A swift victory with minimal casualties. The focus could now shift toward the next and far greater challenge, confronting the Axis powers entrenched in Tunisia. In the following days, the Allied command worked rapidly to consolidate their new foothold. American engineers repaired ports, established supply lines, and converted captured French bases into staging areas for future operations. Medical units treated wounded soldiers, both American and French, while propaganda teams distributed leaflets encouraging unity against the common enemy. The U.S. Army's efficiency impressed even the British High Command. Within weeks, a once chaotic invasion zone had been transformed into a functioning Allied base of operations. Meanwhile, on the German side, Adolf Hitler reacted with fury. The news of France's defection and the loss of North Africa was a devastating blow. In retaliation, German forces occupied the remaining unoccupied zone of France, effectively ending any illusion of French independence under the Vichy regime. The Mediterranean balance had shifted. What began as a bold Allied gamble was now a full-scale strategic success. Operation Torch had not only secured a vast new front for the Allies, but also shattered the myth of Axis invincibility. By the end of November 1942, the map of the war had changed. North Africa, once a stronghold of Axis influence, was now firmly in Allied hands. The United States had proven its capacity to plan, lead, and execute complex operations across continents. The invasion had also delivered an important psychological victory. It restored faith among the Allied nations that liberation, though still distant, was now achievable. The Americans had shown that they could not only fight, but also lead a coalition, manage diplomacy, and inspire hope in territories long oppressed by occupation. The sun set over the harbors of Casablanca and Algiers as American soldiers stood, guard beside French comrades, an uneasy alliance born of necessity, but sustained by a shared vision. The war in North Africa was far from over, but the momentum had shifted irreversibly. The U.S. Army, tested in the crucible of Operation Torch, was now ready for the next campaign. The long, grueling advance into Tunisia, where German forces under Rommel awaited them. When the last echoes of gunfire faded along the Algerian coast, a new silence settled. Heavy, waiting. The Americans had come ashore as invaders and left the beaches as occupiers, but ahead of them lay 1,000 miles of desert and the legendary opponent who ruled it, the German Afrika Korps. In late November 1942, the newly combined Allied force turned its eyes east toward Tunisia. The objective was clear: seize Tunis and Bizerte before the Axis could fortify them. Success would close the southern gate of the Mediterranean. Failure would trap the Allies on the edge of Africa. For the U.S. Army, this was no longer a rehearsal. It was the real war. Convoys of trucks groaned across endless dunes, their engines choking on sand. Soldiers rode in open backs, goggles streaked with dust, rifles clutched tight. The North African winter was deceptive. Days burned with heat, nights froze with desert wind. "The sand gets into everything," one private muttered to a companion. "Even the coffee tastes like the Sahara." The men laughed, but the humor was thin. They were learning that this new front was an enemy of its own. Equipment rusted overnight. Tires burst on rock. Maps were little more than guesses drawn over shifting ground. General Eisenhower established his headquarters in Algiers, coordinating with the British First Army to plan the eastward thrust. Intelligence reports warned that German and Italian troops were already arriving in Tunisia by air and sea, determined to block the Allied advance. Among them was the veteran commander Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, retreating westward after months of fighting in Egypt. The Americans had heard his name whispered with respect and caution. The Desert Fox, master of surprise and maneuver. They were eager, perhaps too eager, to test themselves against him. The first clashes came near the mountain passes around Teburba and Mejez el Bab. There, Green American divisions met disciplined Axis units hardened by years of desert warfare. The difference in experience showed. German tanks struck fast from unseen ridges, firing with deadly precision. They came out of the dust like ghosts, a radio operator recalled. By the time we saw them, half the line was burning. Artillery thundered across the valley as American gunners tried to adjust to the blinding glare and mirage-filled horizons. For many, it was the first time they faced an enemy who fought back with equal ferocity. Eisenhower's staff quickly learned that coordination across multiple national forces, American, British, and newly loyal French, was a complex puzzle. Languages, tactics, even radio frequencies differed. French units, eager to redeem their earlier defeat, launched attacks that sometimes collided with Allied plans. British commanders, cautious from years of desert campaigning, urged patience. The Americans, driven by youthful confidence, pressed ahead. The result was confusion. Convoys lost in sandstorms, air support arriving minutes too late, units advancing without supply lines. Yet through every setback ran the same stubborn determination. As one captain wrote in his field journal, "We are learning the hard way, but we are learning fast." By December, Allied air power began to tilt the balance. American P-38 Lightnings and British Spitfires patrolled the skies over Tunisia, intercepting Axis transports bound for Tunis. Each destroyed aircraft meant fewer reinforcements for Rommel's weary divisions. On the ground, engineers built forward airfields from nothing, flattened earth packed with fuel drums and ambition. The U.S. Army Air Forces, still young, gained crucial experience in coordinating with ground troops, a skill that would later define the campaigns in Italy and France. In the hills west of Tunis, the weather turned violent. Rain transformed the desert into seas of mud. Tanks sank to their turrets. Trucks stalled for hours. Soldiers built fires beneath their vehicles to thaw engines frozen in the cold night air. Supplies arrived late, food spoiled, and tempers shortened. "We fought the rain as much as the Germans," an infantry sergeant said afterward. Yet morale endured. Letters from home carried across the Atlantic kept the men grounded. Simple words from wives, mothers, and sweethearts reminding them why they fought. Through December 1942 and January 1943, the Americans pushed deeper toward Tunisia's mountainous interior. The terrain narrowed into rocky defiles ideal for ambushes. German rearguards mined every road and destroyed every bridge. Engineers worked day and night under sniper fire to keep the advance moving. In one recorded report, a lieutenant described his men clearing explosives with bayonets because they had run out of mine detectors. "You start to feel the ground itself is alive," he said. "Every step could end you." These were lessons written not in textbooks, but in blood. Lessons the U.S. Army would carry into every campaign that followed. Behind the lines, Eisenhower's logistical teams performed quiet miracles. They built supply depots, fuel pipelines, and field hospitals across hundreds of miles of barren land. Thousands of tons of ammunition and food moved daily through improvised rail lines and convoys. American industry, far across the ocean, proved its reach. Tanks, jeeps, and aircraft poured from factories to feed the growing machine of war. Operation Torch had evolved from an invasion into a full-scale campaign sustained by unmatched production power. By early February 1943, the Allied front stretched thin across central Tunisia. The soldiers were exhausted, but hope persisted that the next push would break the Axis line and open the road to victory. They did not yet know that Rommel was preparing a counterstroke, a sharp, punishing lesson that would test the very core of America's newfound confidence. For now, under the dim light of desert fires, the men of Torch wrote home about progress, about camaraderie, about the dream of going onward to Sicily and, someday, France. "We've come this far," one corporal wrote in a letter never meant for publication, "and we're not turning back." The desert wind carried his words eastward, over the dunes and the darkened ridges where German tanks waited in silence. The first great encounter between the United States and the veteran armies of the Axis was about to begin. By February 1943, the desert had turned cold and cruel. The mountains of central Tunisia rose like jagged scars carved by wind and war. The Americans, new to the terrain, stretched their lines thin across unfamiliar ground. They were eager, confident, and unprepared for what was coming. Out there, beyond the ridges, Rommel waited. The Desert Fox had pulled his exhausted Africa corps west from Libya. He saw a chance. Strike hard, break through the passes, and drive the Allies back to the sea. If he succeeded, Operation Torch would crumble before it truly began. The blow came before dawn on February 14th. A rumble in the dark. Tanks rolling through fog. Engines growling like thunder under sand. Then, impact. German armor smashed into the American outposts at Sidi Bouzid. "They're everywhere!" a radio voice shouted before static swallowed the line. Shells tore across the valley. American troops, still learning desert warfare, fought from shallow trenches and thin-skinned tanks. The ground shook beneath them. One gunner whispered, "So this is Rommel." Another answered, "Then we'll teach him who we are." But that morning, teaching would wait. The Germans advanced fast, their tactics precise and merciless. Panzers cut through the 1st Armored Division, circling, isolating, then destroying. Smoke rose in black spirals as jeeps and half-tracks burned. By noon, the desert was a storm of fire and dust. Command posts lost contact. Maps became useless. Men fought in confusion, holding until their ammunition ran out, then retreating on foot through swirling sand. At Kasserine Pass, a narrow gap between two mountain ridges, the retreating Americans regrouped. They dug in. They swore they would not fall back again. General Lloyd Fredendall's headquarters lay far behind, buried deep in a canyon, safe but disconnected. Orders moved slowly. Communication broke. Units acted on instinct. Courage replaced coordination. For 3 days the pass became a cauldron. Artillery thundered from both sides. Aircraft screamed overhead. The wind carried the smell of oil, dust, and fear. "We held the ridge till the guns melted," one corporal recalled. "When they came again, we threw grenades and rocks, anything." Still, Rommel's momentum faltered. His supply lines stretched thin. His tanks, deadly but hungry, needed fuel he could no longer spare. The Americans, bloodied yet unbroken, began to rally. Fresh artillery from the rear roared to life. British reinforcements arrived from the south, bringing order to chaos. For the first time, the Germans felt the pressure turn. On the fourth day, as the sun burned red above the hills, the Africa Corps began to withdraw. The battle that had begun in disaster ended in endurance. The Americans had been beaten tactically, but not spiritually. They had faced the best and survived. In the aftermath, Eisenhower walked among the wrecks. He saw burned tanks, shattered helmets, and men asleep beside their rifles. He said little. The lesson was plain. Leadership had failed. Training had been shallow. Coordination weak. "This will not happen again," one officer told his staff. And it didn't. Within weeks, everything changed. Commanders were replaced. Units were retrained. General George S. Patton arrived to take charge of 2 corps. His presence electrified the front. He demanded discipline, precision, pride. "When you put your helmet on," he told his men, "you carry the flag on your head." The troops responded. The same soldiers who had stumbled at Kasserine began drilling relentlessly, rebuilding confidence shot by shot, march by march. Kasserine was a wound, but a necessary one. It stripped away illusion and replaced it with steel. The U.S. Army learned that courage alone was not enough. Mastery was required, of tactics, of logistics, of command. Out of defeat rose a new army, sharper and more determined. The next time the Americans met Rommel, the outcome would be different. By March 1943, the Allied lines moved forward again. The mountains still echoed with the memory of the fight, but now they carried a new sound. The engines of recovery, the rhythm of preparation, the calm before the counterblow that would sweep the Axis from Africa. The Battle of Kasserine Pass had ended, but its shadow shaped everything that followed. The soldiers who survived would remember it as the place where they first truly became warriors. The world would remember it as the moment the United States learned how to fight and how to win. When the dust settled over Kasserine, the air was thick with silence and resolve. The U.S. Army had bled, stumbled, and learned. It had faced humiliation, but out of that humiliation came hunger, the kind that doesn't fade, the kind that burns, and at its head rode a man who turned that fire into discipline. General George S. Patton. He arrived like a storm. The soldiers felt it before they saw it. The sharp crack of boots on gravel, the gleam of polished steel on his pistol belt, the voice that could cut through the wind. "We're not here to retreat," he told them. "We're here to move forward, fast." His words were more than motivation. They were a commandment. Patton demanded perfection. Helmets buckled, uniforms cleaned, vehicles lined in rows so straight they looked like parade grounds in the middle of the desert. Some grumbled, but most understood. This wasn't about appearance. It was about mindset. A broken army was being rebuilt, one order at a time. Every morning began before dawn. Patton's staff called it the awakening. Troops drilled in dust clouds, engines revved, and gun crews practiced until their hands blistered. He punished carelessness and rewarded precision. "You fight like you train," he said, pacing before his men. "So we'll train like hell. But training alone wouldn't win Africa. Strategy would." Patton reorganized the front, placing trusted commanders in charge of key divisions. He tore through paperwork, personally inspecting supply routes and fuel depots. He demanded efficiency from logistics officers and initiative from field captains. For the first time, the American II Corps began to act as a single machine, coordinated, confident, deadly. In the skies above, Allied air superiority tightened its grip. American P-40 Warhawks and British Spitfires prowled over Axis convoys, hammering fuel depots and transport lines. The Germans, once dominant in the air, now looked up to find the sky against them. "They owned the desert," one pilot said. "We took back the horizon." Meanwhile, across the front, morale shifted. The same soldiers who had flinched at Kasserine now moved with purpose. Letters from home still arrived, but now they were answered with pride, not apology. "Tell them we're ready this time," one private wrote. "Tell them the U.S. Army's not running anymore." By late March, Patton was ready to strike. Intelligence showed Axis forces pulling back toward the coastal cities of Tunis and Bizerte, the last strongholds in North Africa. Rommel himself had departed for Europe, leaving his command to weary subordinates. The Allies sensed weakness, and they would exploit it. The offensive began with thunder. Artillery lined the hills, their barrels glowing red as they fired round after round into German positions. The desert lit up like a storm of fireflies. Tanks advanced in waves, infantry close behind, flags snapping in the wind. Patton's orders were simple. Drive east. Keep pushing. Don't stop until there's nothing left to fight. At El Guitar, the U.S. 1st Infantry Division met the Axis head-on. The battle was fierce, chaotic, and personal. German tanks rolled forward in perfect formation, and the Americans met them with a wall of fire. Anti-tank guns hidden in wadis opened up, cutting through armor at close range. Shell after shell ripped into steel. The panzers kept coming. The Americans held their ground. When the dust cleared, the field was littered with the wrecks of what had once been Rommel's pride. It was the U.S. Army's first clear victory against the Germans in open battle. The message was unmistakable. America had arrived. From that moment, momentum shifted. Every mile east brought more confidence. Coordination between the U.S., British, and Free French forces sharpened. What had once been friction now became precision. British Eighth Army pressed from the south, while Patton's II Corps struck from the west, closing the trap. Axis resistance stiffened, but it no longer controlled the field. The Allies had learned the desert's rhythm, and they were dictating the tempo now. Behind the lines, American logistics worked miracles. Fuel, ammunition, and rations moved seamlessly from the Algerian ports to the front. Mechanics repaired tanks under open skies. Medics set up field hospitals in tents lit by kerosene lamps. Every man had a role, every role mattered. It was the symphony of a modern army. Fast, efficient, relentless. And above it all, the air power never stopped. Day after day, the skies over Tunisia were alive with the roar of Allied aircraft. Bombers struck ports, airfields, and supply columns. Fighters swept the skies clean. Axis convoys trying to cross from Sicily were torn apart before reaching shore. "We owned the day," a pilot later said. They hid from the sun. By April, the Axis front was cracking. Cities that once defied Allied bombardment now burned under constant fire. German commanders pleaded for reinforcements that never came. The Italian divisions, brave but broken, began surrendering in groups. And through it all, Patton's men kept moving. Precise, professional, unrelenting. When Tunis finally fell in May 1943, the campaign that began in doubt ended in triumph. More than 250,000 Axis soldiers were captured. The once feared Africa Corps was no more. North Africa was free, and the Mediterranean lay open to Allied invasion. For the United States, it was a transformation. The same army that had stumbled at Kasserine now stood victorious on the shores of Tunisia. Patton's men had proven themselves not just survivors, but masters of modern war. "We came here as boys," one lieutenant wrote, "and we're leaving as soldiers." the world took notice. The Allies had gained not just territory, they had gained faith in American might. The lessons of Torch and Tunisia would fuel the next great leap: the invasion of Sicily, the march up Italy, and eventually the liberation of France. As the last echoes of battle faded across the desert, the stars rose over quiet fields of rusting tanks and silent guns. The war had moved on, but the legend of Operation Torch had been written. It was a story of pain, patience, and pride, of a young army finding its power, and of a nation proving that when it entered the fire, it didn't burn. It forged steel. The guns finally fell silent over Tunisia. Smoke drifted across the broken plains, curling above the burned wreckage of tanks and trucks. The desert that had swallowed so many dreams was quiet at last. For the soldiers of Operation Torch, the sound of silence was strange, almost unsettling. After 6 months of thunder, it felt like the world itself had stopped to take a breath. They had done it. The Americans, once uncertain, once untested, had fought through chaos, defeat, and doubt, and had come out on top. In May 1943, the Axis flag over North Africa came down. What began as a risky gamble had ended in a defining triumph. The Mediterranean was open. The southern gate of Europe stood exposed. And across the Atlantic, the United States Army, once dismissed as inexperienced, had proven it could take on Hitler's best and win. In Algiers, Allied headquarters buzzed with celebration. Typewriters clattered, telephones rang, maps were redrawn. Officers from every nation shook hands, raising tin cups of coffee and whiskey and toast. For a brief moment, exhaustion gave way to pride. Eisenhower, always measured, allowed himself a quiet smile. "We have learned how to fight together," he said simply. That single sentence captured the miracle of Torch, the forging of unity between Americans, British, and Free French forces who had once doubted each other's resolve. Yet beneath the celebrations lay something deeper: transformation. The U.S. Army that landed in North Africa in 1942 was not the same army that stood there in 1943. It had been reshaped by experience, tempered by loss, hardened by leadership. The men had learned to trust their weapons, their officers, and each other. They had learned that bravery wasn't loud. It was steady. It was the grunt who loaded the last shell, the medic who crawled into gunfire, the engineer who built a bridge under bombs. This, they understood now, was what victory was made of. Across the Allied world, news of the success electrified morale. Newspapers in New York, London, and Paris printed headlines that spoke of a turning tide. For the first time, Americans saw photographs of their soldiers standing proudly beside British and French comrades under the African sun. They looked strong, confident, unstoppable. The myth of German invincibility was cracking, and America was holding the hammer. In Washington, the mood shifted from anxiety to ambition. Operation Torch had proven that American industry and logistics could sustain global warfare. From Detroit to Seattle, factories roared day and night, turning out tanks, aircraft, and rifles faster than the Axis could destroy them. Every jeep that rolled through the desert, every bomber that darkened the sky, was a symbol of a nation's willpower made real. The arsenal of democracy had found its rhythm, and it was deafening. But victory wasn't just measured in steel or numbers. It was measured in knowledge. The generals studied every battle, every misstep, every lesson learned from Torch. They rewrote manuals, restructured commands, redefined how to fight a global war. They studied supply chains, combined arms tactics, and air-ground coordination. The errors of Kasserine became the blueprints for success in Sicily, Normandy, and beyond. Torch had been more than an invasion. It had been a classroom in the art of modern war. For the French, the victory carried a different kind of weight. Their homeland was still under Nazi occupation, but the victory in North Africa reignited pride and purpose. Free French forces, once scattered and uncertain, now stood under their own flag again, fighting alongside allies who respected them. "France lives," said General Charles de Gaulle in a broadcast from London, "and she will return." Those words reached every corner of occupied Europe. A promise that liberation was no longer a dream, but a plan. As spring turned to summer, the Allies began to prepare for their next move. Sicily was the next target, the first step into Fortress Europe. Operation Torch had given them everything they needed: experience, confidence, coordination, and momentum. The mistakes of the past were gone. The machinery of victory was now in motion. Meanwhile, in the ranks, soldiers packed up their gear with mixed emotions. They had survived Africa, but the war was far from over. Some cleaned their weapons in silence, staring toward the sea. Others laughed and sang, proud but restless. "If we can beat them here," one sergeant said, "we can beat them anywhere." Those words echoed through the camps, carried on the warm desert wind. For the United States, Operation Torch was more than a battle. It was a declaration. It told the world that America was not a follower in this war. It was a leader. It proved that U.S. soldiers could land on foreign soil, face seasoned enemies, and rise stronger from defeat. It showed that the American way of war, fast, adaptive, relentless, was something new, something the Axis had not prepared for. The desert, once a place of confusion, had become the forge of American strength. The names of its battles, Oran, Algiers, Kasserine, El Guettar, would live on, etched into history as the proving ground of a superpower in the making. The men who fought there would carry those memories with them to Sicily, to Normandy, to the Rhine. And when the war finally ended, they would look back and say, "It all began in North Africa." As the sun set on the final day of the campaign, a convoy of American jeeps rolled past the ruins of a German camp. A soldier sitting in the back turned to watch the horizon fade behind him. "We came as strangers," he murmured. "We're leaving as conquerors." The engine roared, the sand lifted, and the convoy disappeared into the distance, headed not home, but forward, into history. Operation Torch was over. The United States had crossed its first great ocean, fought its first modern campaign, and emerged not just victorious, but transformed. From the beaches of Morocco to the ridges of Tunisia, the message was clear. When America landed, the world shifted, and the war for freedom had only just begun. The winds over North Africa carried more than dust now. They carried destiny. In the months following Operation Torch, the Allied flags waved over cities once bound by tyranny. The world had watched an untested army cross an ocean, confront the Axis, and emerge victorious. America's baptism by fire had become its ascension. What began in the deserts of Morocco and Tunisia would soon echo across the beaches of Europe. The victory in North Africa changed everything. It transformed Allied strategy, morale, and momentum. For the first time since the war began, the Allies had seized the initiative. The German myth of invincibility had cracked, and through that crack, light poured. The lessons of Torch, logistics, leadership, coordination, became the blueprint for every campaign that followed. The desert, in all its cruelty, had taught the Allies how to win a global war. Across the Mediterranean, Preparations for the next invasion were already underway. The target, Sicily. Operation Husky would be the next great test, the bridge to Europe itself. But this time, the Americans were not the rookies. They were the standard. Veterans of Torch led the charge, carrying with them the memory of every mistake and every triumph from North Africa. "We learned in blood," one sergeant said as he boarded a ship for Sicily, "so we wouldn't have to bleed twice." From Eisenhower's headquarters came a quiet confidence. The teamwork forged in Africa, between American drive and British experience, between Free French pride and Allied vision, had become the foundation of a coalition unlike any the world had ever seen. The divisions that once divided nations were gone. Now they moved as one, and at the center of that unity stood the Americans. Their presence no longer questioned, their strength undeniable. In factories across the United States, the rhythm of war production became the heartbeat of the free world. Shipyards launched vessels faster than the Axis could sink them. Assembly lines rolled out tanks, trucks, and planes in numbers that defied imagination. Every crate marked "Made in USA" carried a piece of the victory to come. The same industrial might that fueled Torch now fueled the liberation of Europe. The world was learning that America's strength wasn't just in its weapons, it was in its will. For the men who had fought in Torch, the memory of North Africa never faded. They remembered the blinding sun, the sting of sand, the sound of aircraft roaring overhead. They remembered comrades lost in the dunes, names spoken in whispers beside campfires. They carried those memories with them through Italy, through Normandy, through the final push into Germany. Every victory traced its roots back to those first desperate battles in 1942, when everything was uncertain and nothing was guaranteed. When Allied troops landed on the beaches of Sicily in July 1943, they moved with precision born of experience. The coordination between air, land, and sea was flawless. The mistakes of Kasserine were gone, replaced by mastery. Within weeks, the island fell. The door to Europe swung open, and behind that door waited the greatest challenge of all, the liberation of France. It was poetic, almost fated, that the journey to free Europe would begin with lessons learned on African soil. The very same soldiers who had once fought the French Vichy forces in Morocco and Algeria would soon fight for France, to restore her freedom, her dignity, her place among the nations. What had begun as confrontation ended as redemption. The U.S. Army, once seen as a supporting partner, had become the driving engine of liberation. By 1944, the name Operation Torch was spoken with reverence among Allied planners. It was the prototype, the first large-scale amphibious invasion of the war, the experiment that proved what was possible. Its success gave the Allies the confidence to attempt the unthinkable. Operation Overlord, the D-Day invasion of Normandy. When American soldiers waded ashore on June 6, 1944, they carried more than rifles and courage. They carried the spirit of Torch. The teamwork, the logistics, the iron resolve born in North Africa all came ashore with them. General Eisenhower, now Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force, knew it better than anyone. The same leadership principles he honed in Algiers, diplomacy, cooperation, patience, guided him through the largest invasion in history. From the beaches of Normandy to the liberation of Paris, the echo of Torch was everywhere. North Africa had been the rehearsal. Europe was the encore. Back in the United States, families followed the news with hope and pride. They remembered where it started. Those first brave landings in Morocco and Algeria, the headlines that spoke of the first American victory. The war was far from over, but the direction was clear. The tide that had begun to turn in 1942 was now a flood sweeping across the continent. When victory finally came in 1945, many soldiers looked back to where it all began. For them, North Africa wasn't just another campaign. It was the moment America proved itself to the world. It was the moment the U.S. Army stopped being a question mark and became an exclamation point. "We were forged in the desert," one veteran said decades later, "and from that fire, we shaped the world." Operation Torch remains one of the defining chapters of World War II, not for its size, but for its significance. It was where the Allies learned unity, where the Americans earned respect, and where history changed direction. It was where the torch of freedom was lit, burning across the dunes, carried from Africa to Europe, and finally, to victory. As the sun set on the war's final days, the veterans of Torch stood among the victors of history. They had crossed the ocean as strangers, fought as brothers, and returned as heroes. They had faced doubt, defeat, and destiny, and they had won. The world they helped to save would remember their journey forever, because in the end, Operation Torch was not just an invasion. It was a symbol of courage found, unity forged, and freedom reclaimed. It was the moment the United States stepped fully onto the world stage, torch in hand, lighting the path toward a new dawn of hope. And that light, the light born in the sands of North Africa, still burns today.